наш гость Джозефа Макиннеса, как все, наверное, вы видели по антигенам. И, наверное, многим интересно, как так случилось, что докладчик, который представляет доклад по-английски, оказался сотрудником высшей школы Канады. Ну, вот так бывает. И у Джозефа, на самом деле, очень интересная исследовательская биография. Он работал и в Канаде, и в Шотландии, и теперь он работает в России, что на самом деле требует немало смелости от зарубежного исследователя. Тем не менее, он работает очень продуктивно, как вы сейчас убедитесь. Джозеф представит свои новые исследования. И несмотря на то, что доклад будет проходить по-английски, Джозеф на самом деле понимает и немного говорит по-русски. В чем у вас будет возможность убедиться в перерыве, когда вы подойдете поговорить. Но на самом деле немного, поэтому он еще очень стесняется говорить по-русски, поэтому основная часть научная вся у нас будет проходить по-английски. Опять же, по просьбам и по рекомендации, которая существует на докладе Джозефа, у нас будет резюмирующий перевод. Я подозреваю, что для большинства участников не нужен.
Да, может быть, и обойдемся без резюмирующего.
Значит, всегда вопрос, есть ли те, кто стесняется сказать, что он нужен. Давайте мы начнем. Если все будут очень бурно возмущаться, тогда мы его постепенно сведем на нет. Я постараюсь говорить очень быстро и очень коротко, для того, чтобы побольше времени оставить докладчику. Хорошо? Ну что, в таком случае предоставляю слово докладчику. Джозеф, пожалуйста. So you probably understood the part of the introduction that was mostly about that people can try and talk to you in Russian. And that you are especially a very brave person to come to do your research in Russia. And that you are very productive doing your research in Russia. And we are going to see that because you are presenting your research.
Thank you for inviting me today. I will try to speak slowly, and please feel free to interrupt if you have any questions or if you need to clarify any points or to ask for translations. My research is on vision, attention, and computational modeling. So I'd like to talk about 3 different things today. A couple of 1 or 2 old experiments, but then mostly new experiments. And I was told that I wouldn't be asked to come back unless I talked about Jarvis while I was here. So the middle part is all over an experiment. Some experiment, classic eye-tracking from Jarvis. To start with, I will look at descriptive analysis of eye movements in visual search. What we can learn about low-level eye movements and what they tell us about attention and cognition. For the second part, I'll take those low-level eye movements and try to train a classifier to determine what task or instructions a participant is given. That's the part that's very closely aligned to the classic Jarvis study. And then finally, I'll show you a new computational model that I've been working on that includes task switching and top-down control of eye movements and tasks. To start with, most of you, I'm sure, know about eye movements. We move our eyes roughly 3 times every second. This is to bring the high-resolution fovea to different parts of the scene. Our visual system works to maneuver the eye to get that high resolution to areas of interest. These are called saccades, and they're very ballistic eye movements. They last only about 40 milliseconds, and they're followed by roughly 250 milliseconds of fixation. Visual attention is often said to be very closely aligned to eye movements, and this is to not only to focus our attention and focus the information, but to limit the information that we get in. Some people say that it's like a spotlight. We shine our spotlight on different parts of the scene. And we have both overt attention, where we're actively looking at an object, and covert attention, where we can attend to an item without looking at it. Most of what I'll be talking about today is overt attention, where attention and eye movements align. So why do we move our eyes? There's some classic models of information intake by Koch back in 2000. They had a salience model where the visual system brings in salience information through multiple channels, through color, through luminance, and these are combined to create a salience map. And this salience map shows us which areas are the most interesting in the scene, and we move our eyes to those areas of interest. The problem with something like this is once we have a salience map of interested areas, why aren't we always moving our eyes back to the same high salient locations? Well, Koch mentioned one possibility, and that was the idea that inhibition of return, a mid-level attentional mechanism, helps us to keep us from going back to places that we've already attended. So this is the old Posner idea of inhibition of return, where we have, in the simple version of the experiment, we have two possible locations, and the participant is looking at the center. We cue one of the locations, and then bring the attention back to center. And we can present a probe now, either in the cued location or in the uncued location. So in this case, the probe shows up in the cued location, and we have to respond quickly to this probe. The classic result, the classic trade-off here, early on, if we present that probe very quickly after the location is cued, then we see an advantage at that location. We're faster to respond to targets in that location than the uncued location. But if we wait a little while, 300 milliseconds or later, then that facilitation switches to inhibition. And this has since been called inhibition of return, where we're slower to respond to targets in a location where we have previously attended.
Как вы уже поняли, доклад будет состоять из 3 частей. И эти 3 части будут посвящены 3 задачам, которые могут решать исследование движений глаз. Начиная с наименее теоретически нагруженной описательной, затем будет показан действие классификатора, который на основе характеристик движений глаз будет выявлять, какие инструкции были даны его задачу. И, наконец, будет представлена более теоретически нагруженная модель, в которой будут даны некоторые попытки объяснить. Подход, который будет дан в докладе, будет не чисто экспериментально-психологическим, будет совмещен с методами компьютерного моделирования. Таким образом, получается одновременно и психология, и компьютерная наука, computer science. Затем речь пошла об основных типах движений глаз. Краткий обзор нам показал, что существуют сакаты, которые перемежаются фиксациями. Было сказано несколько слов о количественных характеристиках сакат. И также мы вспомнили о метафоре прожектора исследования внимания. Интересно, что наиболее ранние модели зрительного поиска это модели, имеется в виду модели компьютерные, это модели, которые построены на перцептивной отличимости каких-либо объектов или мест в пространстве. И эти модели охватывают только одну сторону внимания, это так называемое явное внимание, в противоположность скрытому вниманию, которое осуществляется без движения глаз. Соответственно, в докладе будет идти речь в основном об этом явном внимании. И если мы будем строить модель, которая будет ориентироваться в первую очередь на перцептивную отличимость, то тогда возникнет один интересный вопрос. Допустим, внимание и движение глаз все время перемещаются в ту зону, которая характеризуется максимальной такой перцептивной яркостью, перцептивной отличимостью. Что же заставляет нас продолжать поиск, почему глаза не возвращаются все время к одному и тому же наиболее выделяющемуся пятну в зрительной сцене? Какие есть механизмы, которые это предотвращают? В частности, один из таких механизмов, возможно, это механизм торможения возврата, который был продемонстрирован с помощью познеровской методики подсказки. Вы обратили внимание на то, что классический результат, который вот здесь представлен внизу на графике, показывает, что подсказка действует таким образом, что через небольшой промежуток времени после подсказки внимание легче приближается к подсказанному месту, а через значительный промежуток времени после подсказки внимание к этому месту привлечь уже сложнее.
So, we have inhibition of return in individual eye movements, but we don't make eye movements in isolation. We make multiple eye movements, and we do this all the time in very complex tasks. So if we want to find out what we can discover about eye movements in complex tasks, we need to study them in that environment. So one of the environments that I enjoy working in is these picture books called Where's Wally or Where's Waldo. It's a children's book where the task is to search for this little character here. His name is Wally. And you have to make many eye movements to try to find this character in the scene. And it's a wonderful task because we can get people searching for a long time. And we can monitor their eye movements while they do this. Everyone find it? So, we have people searching in these complex scenes in a very natural way. Rather than present our probes the way that Posner did, we can actually present our probes based on where people were looking in the scene. So, given a pattern of eye movements like this, we can present a probe now either in a location where they have previously fixated, or opposite that, or in any equidistant circle around the current location. So the 0 degree has been previously fixated and should be inhibited compared to the other locations. We can also do that in the 2-back location because inhibition of return can be measured in multiple previous locations. And that's what I worked on during my PhD with Ray Klein back in Dalhousie. And we found just that in one of these complex, long search scenes, we're still able to measure inhibition of returns at probe locations where participants have already previously visited. And same in 2003, we did this again, but asking them to stop when they find something interesting first, to get rid of any type of remote bias. So this was showing that we are able to measure these mid-level attention effects and mechanisms during complex sequences of eye movements.
По сравнению с задачей Познера, Джо использует достаточно сложную, приближенную к реальности задачу для исследования торможения возврата. Как было показано, любимым примером и любимым стимульным материалом для него служат детские книжки «Найди Болли». У нас они не так распространены, наверняка вы видели похожие примеры в интернете. Болли — это вот этот вот замечательный персонаж, и нужно найти его среди массы людей. На каждой картинке такая толпа меняется. Соответственно, здесь мы его нашли или не нашли. А теперь вопрос, как мы можем с помощью этого изучать торможение возврата. Мы можем показывать человеку подсказку, но мы можем также и фиксировать его движение глаз, и, соответственно, мы можем показывать цель или в том месте, которое он фиксировал перед этим, или в противоположном направлении на 180 градусов, или в любой другой равноудаленной точке. Аналогичным образом можно смотреть не только предыдущую фиксацию, но и две предыдущих фиксации, поскольку торможение возврата может быть достаточно длительным процессом, и результаты были представлены в двух работах, в частности, одна из них была диссертация Джозефа.
So, that was background. This was previous research. What we wanted to do for something new was to see what other types of patterns we could detect in sequences of eye movements. We get lots of very rich information from the eye tracker in one of these scenes. So what we did, we brought back the Where's Wally scenes. We asked our participants to search for 2 minutes with no other task, no secondary probes, no interruptions, just 2 minutes of searching. So what we managed to get was 8 participants, 13 different images, and thousands of eye movements per subject. And with this, we wanted to try to discover what types of patterns we could find in eye movements, and what those patterns would tell us about top-down attention, bottom-up salience, and mid-level attention, like inhibition and return. Typically with the search, the only things that we're interested in are things like the slope of search. That's a traditional measure of visual search. Sometimes you look at the errors, maybe the time to the first fixation of some region of interest, or maybe the distribution of relative angles. We wanted to go beyond that to find richer patterns in the eye movements. So one of the first things we looked at was a description of all of the results, but grouped according to subject and grouped according to image. Now our idea here was that any patterns that were similar with the subject, so our subjects are the columns, then that would be a reflection of top-down strategy, something that participant chose to do across all of the images. Whereas any patterns we see for a particular image that cross all subjects, this was something to do with the low-level salience of that image. I think that's what I wanted to do.
Okay. Итак, Джон демонстрирует, как они решали первую задачу описания движений глаз. Для этого они записали достаточно большой материал, в ходе которого испытуемые осуществляли свободный поиск, то есть они не прерывались никакими дополнительными экспериментальными манипуляциями. Достаточно большой массив данных, и помимо стандартных характеристик, в частности, тех, которые обычно собираются для исследования зрительного поиска, таких как время до первой фиксации, распределение углов последовательных саккад и наклон кривых зрительного поиска, они строили более сложную картину, а именно они предположили, что можно выделить некоторые паттерны, характерные для отдельного изображения и для отдельного испытуемого. И паттерны, характерные для отдельного испытуемого, будут отображать некоторые стратегии поиска, а паттерны, характерные для отдельного изображения, будут отображать как раз ту самую пресловутую перцептивную отличность.
So I will mention one more thing about this because it's a pattern that I hope to use a number of times in this analysis. So columns are subjects and top down. Rows are images and bottom up. So for example, the first bar here is the latency of the saccades. The second one is the amplitude of the saccade. And the third one is the overall search time for that image. And when it's orange and down, that means it's below average. Blue and up means that it's above average. And here is the mean for this subject, and over there is the mean for each image. So this means that for subject 1, they were below average for latency, above average saccadic amplitude, and slightly below average search time. And if you take a look at the patterns here, this subject is consistently below average for saccadic latency across all of the images. So this we took as evidence that this subject was using that as a search strategy. What didn't have much to do with which image it was in, because it's the same strategy across all images. Whereas this one here, that search time, so this one here, for search time and for saccadic latency, every subject tends to be slower than average for both latency and for search time. And because that's for this image, and all subjects have that pattern for that image, then it's properties of that image that were causing these slow search times and slow latencies. So this we took as evidence for bottom-up patterns.
Okay. Еще несколько пояснений по поводу того, как читать вот эти диаграммы, поскольку они встретятся еще впоследствии. Вот эти вот небольшие столбики отображают значения параметров и отображают выше или ниже они, чем в среднем. Соответственно, синее вверх это выше, чем в среднем, оранжевое вниз это ниже, чем в среднем. И таким образом можно по вот этому цветовому кодированию уже сразу смотреть, есть ли у испытуемого некоторая стратегия, то есть есть ли некоторый нисходящий процесс для него характерный, или есть ли у изображения некоторая характеризующая его особенность, которая будет приводить к соответствующему восходящему процессу. Ну, например, вот этот первый испытуемый, мы видим, что у него по первому столбику все значения оранжевые и вниз. Это означает, что по латентности первой саккады, прошу прощения, не первой, по латентности саккады, у этого испытуемого значение постоянно ниже, чем в среднем. Значит, он применял некоторую стратегию. А вот для этого изображения мы также видим, что у всех испытуемых значения будут ниже, чем в среднем, значит, у этого изображения есть какие-то характерные особенности. Ну и на самом деле здесь представлена не только латентность, здесь представлено несколько сразу характеристик саккады. То есть это латентность, амплитуда и временность.
I'm just going to say this is a good time for questions because I will use this grouping for a number of another analysis.
What if it's not a strategy, but a sort of individual differences, some neurophysiological differences or something like that?
Mm-hmm. It's definitely subject-based, so it could very well be individual differences, but whether it's a conscious strategy or simply a preference or individual difference, that's also possible.
So the question is whether it is top-down or not.
Right. It's definitely not salience-based. That will be the distinguishing factor at the moment. The image one we're calling salience-based. This is something other than salience-based.
Еще вопросы? Пожалуйста.
What mean is на русском языке? Какое среднее вычиталось по испытуемому или по всем испытуемым сразу?
So what average was used, what mean value was used for those errors? Was it or mean for a subject or mean for a space?
It's the overall that we use to calculate the Z scores. Since we needed to find out for the mean, the average image, and average subject, we needed the overall mean to compute those things.
Еще вопросы?
MacInnes?
No more questions?
Okay. So we have this grouping by image and grouping by subject. Now we wanted to try to find patterns in eye movements that people typically don't look for. So to do that, we needed to look for patterns over time. Because eye movements don't happen in isolation, they happen in sequence. So we looked to a number of other very interesting algorithms from other fields. And those fields include business, data mining, genetics. All of those have wonderful algorithms they use to look for patterns in sequences. Genetics, for example, looks for patterns of gene expression within a gene sequence. So they look for repeating patterns over time. And one of the algorithms, there have been a couple of other people looking for patterns like this in eye movements. SCASM is one, and ScanMatch is another. Christino, 2010, and Vandenasberg, 2011, have some nice papers doing similar work. So the algorithm that they use is called genetic search. And genetic search tries to look for sequences by finding similar subsequences within that string. So, for example, ATC appears a couple of times, and GA appears a couple of times. So, a good genetic algorithm will discover those subsequences. The first thing we needed to do for eye movements was to convert our eye movement data into something like this that the genetic algorithm would understand. So to do that, we looked at something that we knew was important for eye movements, and that was the stochastic angle. And this was a measure that we used back in the 1999 and 2003 papers, where the angle between the current eye movement and the previous eye movement is a measure of whether you went back to the same location or forward to a new location. So 0 degrees would be looping backwards, and 180 degrees would be going forward. We can look at the 1 back location or the 2 back angle. And once we've classified all of the eye movements in terms of their angle, we can then look at the sequence of angles as opposed to the full eye movement data.
Еще одна очень важная вещь, которую Джозеф делает в своем исследовании, это изучение временных последовательностей движений глаз. Несмотря на то, что движение глаз не существует поодиночке, статистика, которую мы смотрели до того, рассматривает их вне зависимости от того, в какой последовательности они шли. Для того, чтобы изучать цепочки характерной последовательности движений глаз, приходится привлекать методы из смежных дисциплин, в частности, из анализа данных в бизнесе и в генетике. В генетике есть очень полезные методы, поскольку как раз генетикам приходится много иметь дело с последовательностями, например, вот с такими знакомыми многим последовательностями символов, отражающих структуру генетического материала. И что важно, внутри этих последовательностей генетики умеют выделять цепочки, которые встречаются и повторяются, и то же самое можно сделать и для движений глаз. Но чтобы это сделать, необходимо каким-то образом описать движение глаз так, чтобы можно было применять кинетический алгоритм. И в частности, чтобы в этом описании присутствовал также торможение возврата, которое очень важно, как мы уже поняли из предыдущего рассказа. Значит, что для этого можно сделать? Для этого можно использовать угол. И вот на этой диаграмме показано, как мы можем посмотреть углы саккад. Соответственно, мы можем посмотреть, под каким углом шла саккада относительно предыдущей и относительно идущей перед предыдущей. И дальше мы можем эту цепочку продолжать, посмотреть, например, что было 3 саккады назад, и построить таким образом цепочку углов.
So we have our long string of angles now that we converted our eye movements into. The other thing that a genetic algorithm needs is a way to compare 2 strings, to be able to say how similar 2 strings are. Because not everything's going to be an exact match, especially with angles. If one person moves their eyes back 179 degrees, is that the same as 178 or 176? Or what do we need to be close to the same sequence? So we used a measure called Wiedemann-Wunsch. I won't get into the math in this one. Anybody that wants to ask me about it, I'll be happy to answer questions. But the main thing to remember is that this algorithm will give us a value of +1 if the sequence is exactly the same. It will give us a value of -1 if they are very, very different. And a range in between depending on how similar they are. It basically calculates the amount of work it takes to convert from one sequence into another sequence. So +1 for very similar, -1 for very, very different. And then we went back to our idea of grouping by image and grouping by subject or observer. And we also wanted to see if these patterns of eye movements if there were any patterns. So do people repeat the same sequence of angles over and over? Or is it mostly random, a random selection of angle choices? And a couple of things to notice from this graph. First off, all of the values are negative. And negative, if you remember, means that there's not many similarities. The sequences of angles, there's not many patterns. If this were at +1, that would mean that they always use the same angles over and over again. -1 means that there are no patterns at all. If you compare the green here, which is the sequence of eye movements that our participants made, against a randomized order, we do see a significant difference. So there are some patterns that we are able to discover with eye movements. So there are some patterns, there are repeating sequences of eye movements, but they're very, very weak. We also took a look at our idea of grouping the data by image and grouping the data by subject to see if these patterns were stronger when we group by subject, which was either top-down, if you agree with that, or at least not bottom-up, or grouping by image, which is a bottom-up salience estimation. And we found no difference in our average similarity score, based on which way we did that grouping. So there was no difference. The patterns didn't change based on bottom-up salience or by grouping by subject. So one concern you might have on this is whether we're able to pick up on patterns at all. So one thing we did look at was a replication by Gilchrist and Harvey in 2006. They found that they could change the pattern of eye movement angles. They mostly looked at 0 and 180, either back or forward eye movements. And they did that based on how regular the scene was. And they showed that if you had a regular scene like this, you have much more drastic pattern of forward and backward eye movements, as opposed to a less regular scene, which produced a very different pattern. We didn't have that type of control over our images, but we did have two scenes that had very, very random images, and one with these pictures that had more regular spacing of items in the visual search. So we did the exact same analysis that Gilchrist and Harvey did, but with our images, and we showed that our Needleman-Wunsch was able to come up with the same result that Gilchrist and Harvey did. There were more patterns that we were able to discover with the regular scenes than with the irregular scenes. So we were able to replicate with our more realistic data the same type of result that Gilchrist and Harvey had with their control data.
Итак, следующий вопрос, который возникает, как же сравнить между собой две последовательности после того, как мы их описали, потому что не очень понятно, на основании какого критерия мы будем считать последовательность исходными или различными. Соответственно, вводится некоторый индекс сходства, который, как мы посмотрели, будет равен плюс единице, если сходство последовательности будет максимальным, то есть мы можем увидеть такие паттерны, и будет отрицательным, равен минус единице, если таких паттернов вообще нет. По материалу, который был собран в лаборатории Джо, оказалось, что какие-то паттерны при поиске более есть, но их количество невелико. Возник вопрос, почему так происходит, и вот ответ на него был найден в одном исследовании, которое проводилось несколько раньше, это был фестиваль, которые показали, что для более регулярных зрительных сцен наблюдается больше паттернов характерных последовательностей движений глаз. Если же сцены менее регулярные, то, соответственно, характерных паттернов меньше. Оценив регулярность тех зрительных сцен более натуральных, которые они использовали, Джо убедился в том, что это действительно так, и что фактически они воспроизвели результаты Гилкреста и Харли на более реалистичных зрительных сценах.
One other thing we can look at is patterns within the latency of the eye movements. So this is the fixation duration prior to the saccade, the length of that duration. And if we are seeing things like mid-level attention, patterns of mid-level attention within the eye movements, then we should be able to see some effects of that within those fixation durations. The idea behind spotting inhibition of return in visual search is not only that you tend to go back less frequently to areas where you have been, but when you do go back to those locations, we should be able to spot some sort of effect on the patterns of eye movements. So we took a look at the latencies of those eye movements and grouped them according to the relative saccadic amplitude. So this is the difference between the length of the current eye movement compared to the previous eye movement. With negative numbers, meaning that the previous eye movement was long and the current eye movement was short. And positive numbers, meaning that the current eye movement was long and the previous eye movement was short. So we subtracted the length of the two eye movements in visual degrees. And that means that a 0 on relative amplitude means that the two eye movements were the exact same size. We also grouped according to the angle. And again, 180 means that they kept on moving in the same direction, so two eye movements in the same direction. And 0 means that they went backwards to the previous location. So what we have here is a 0-degree angle combined with a 0-degree relative amplitude means that they not only went back the same direction that they came from, but they landed in the exact same location that they had been in. And what what we've seen from inhibition of return, that should be a very slow location. And that's exactly what we found. At that 0, 0, in particular, we found a very slow saccadic latencies. So the fixation durations prior to that eye movement tended to be much slower than other locations. So, a summary of the first part. Again, this is just the descriptive analysis of the eye movements. We were able to observe inhibition of return with many saccades in our visual search. This holds true in both controlled studies and free search such as this one, and that we are able to pick up attention and inhibition of return in these free search eye movements, behavioral changes in those. And we were also able to show some new algorithms for spotting patterns in the eye movements themselves.
И резюме по первой части, как вы уже поняли, предыдущего графика, с помощью использованного метода анализа можно показать наличие торможения возврата и при свободном поиске без специальных экспериментальных манипуляций с внедрением объекта в картинку. В частности, можно показать, что при возвращении взгляда в ту же точку, которая посещалась перед этим, движение глаз замедляется. И по резюме мы видим, что по первой части описательной можно показать, что как в специально контролируемых условиях, так и в ситуации свободного поиска можно продемонстрировать наличие торможения возврата и можно характеризовать основные явления внимания.
Next step, we're actually going to get to a classifier. We're actually going to do something with these patterns. And this is a little more fun. Should we start with
questions? У кого есть вопросы по первой части?
I don't blame you. That part is very, very dry. We're getting to the fun part. And then it's fun because I've done it recently as well. So this is stuff that was a little over a year ago and maybe even longer. So. The next part I'd like to talk about is what we can do with this. There's a wonderful old idea. I think you may have heard of it before. It's a researcher, a Russian researcher by the name of Jarvis. He's back in 1967. He pioneered some very interesting algorithm research and showed that when you give a participant different tasks, their eye movements patterns tend to be very different. So examples like this, some of the instructions that he gave his participant were free examination. So just look at this image and see what you think of it. And the eyes move, looking through the image, looking for interesting elements. Or you could say, estimate the material circumstances of the family. And with that, you get a very different pattern of eye movements, focusing on different parts of the picture. Or you could ask, give the ages of the people, and there you get a drastically different pattern of eye movements. So the idea here is that the different instructions are generating a different pattern of eye movements through the exact same picture. This back in 1967, this was a very difficult task. I think they used coils on the eyes. It was a very, very difficult procedure to bring participants through. So there was only, I think, just one participant at the time. But it's been replicated since. Lucia and Helza in 2009 had a replication with multiple participants where they showed similar patterns with multiple subjects. Now, the idea behind this that people have often quoted but never tested was the inverse of this. Jarvis showed that given different instructions, you could generate different eye movement patterns. But people have took this to mean that given the different eye movement patterns, you could tell what somebody's task or instruction was. And that hadn't been tested before until a couple of people, I'll show you some research, but what this typically is, where you try to infer what class or category something is in based on observations, that's a classification problem in machine learning. So computer scientists are aware of this type of problem, and they call it classification. So they have lots of wonderful algorithms to tackle this. And the question becomes what category or what instructions were given to a participant based only on the eye movement patterns. There's lots of examples of successful algorithms doing this already. If you think of email and spam, this is something that they use classifiers for. Given the text of an email, can you say that this is spam or not spam? Data packets and denial of service, another one in computer science. When you see packets coming across the web, can you tell if this is an attack or not? Attack or not attack? That's the classification. An MRI scan and tumor or not. Given an image, a series of pixels of someone's lung or brain, can you tell whether that image contains a tumor or not a tumor? These are all classification problems. Another fun one, given an input of signal from outer space, can you tell was that generated by aliens or random noise of the universe? That one's actually an unsupervised problem because we don't know beforehand whether these signals are aliens or not. I don't think we do. Does anybody have a labeled data set for whether a signal comes from an alien? I haven't seen it yet anyway, so we'll call it unsupervised for now. And there's lots of good algorithms for this, Bayesian algorithms, neural networks, bagging and boosting. These are all algorithms that computer scientists have developed to solve these types of problems. So we want to add one more type of problem to that, and that is classifying tasks based on items.
Итак, Джо говорит, что мы поступаем в более веселой части, в том числе потому, что она была сделана относительно недавно, и вторая часть будет посвящена проблеме классификации. О чем здесь пойдет речь? Об установлении соответствия между движениями глаз и задачей, которую выполняет человек. Но я думаю, что в этой аудитории не нужно подробно пересказывать исследования Альфреда Лукьяновича Ямуса. Все знают знаменитую работу, в которой испытуемым давались различные инструкции относительно того и того же изображения, например, оценить возраст людей, изображенных на картине, или просто ее разглядывать. И в результате получались различные движения глаз, различные паттерны движения глаз, соответствующие задаче, потому что изображение не менялось. Эта работа впоследствии воспроизводилась на более современных технологиях и с большим количеством испытуемых. И уже совершенно очевидно, что разные задачи будут вызывать разные паттерны движения глаз. Но как насчет установления обратного соответствия? Можем ли мы по паттерну движения глаз вычислить, какая задача решалась? И вот на этот вопрос пока однозначного ответа нет. Каким образом можно к нему подступиться? Существует большое количество методов, разработанных, опять же, в области компьютерных наук, в области технологий машинного обучения. Джо привел примеры успешного решения таких задач, в частности, когда на вашем почтовом сервере робот классифицирует письма на нужные вам и спам, когда компьютерная программа помогает радиологу, пытаясь определить, где на снимке может находиться опухоль, или существует также другой класс программ машинного обучения, методов машинного обучения, которые можно назвать обучением без учителя, потому что если в случае с опухолью и со спамом вы можете, конечно, сказать, была там опухоль или относилось ли письмо к спаму, то, например, в случае, если ваша задача это установить приходящие из космоса сигналы, являются посланием инопланетян или все-таки некоторые случайные шуты, никто вам наверняка этого сказать не может. И вот вся эта совокупность методов, включая нейронные сети, байесовские классификаторы и некоторые другие менее известные когнитивным исследователям методы, можно использовать для того, чтобы решить задачу, которую Джо обозначает как ярбусовский классификатор.
Questions?
Questions on this? Sorry. Вопросы по прошедшей части. Вопросов, видимо, нет. No questions so far.
Okay, good. You also mentioned that the break is customary. Is it?
Yes, we can actually make a break after the second part.
Okay, the last part is actually a small part. So that's this might be a good time to a little more than halfway.
Коллеги, необходим ли перерыв на самом интересном месте?
No? Okay. Keep going. So we have a number of very interesting studies that have also been looking at this problem. The first one was Green et al. In 2012. This came from Jeremy Wolf's lab. If you were lucky enough to see his talk recently, they have some great stuff coming from there. But Michel Green, one of his colleagues, was the first one to actually try this. And they used a linear algorithm called a support vector machine. And they tried 4 different tasks. So they gave the participants one of 4 different tasks and measured their eye movements in those tasks. And the 4 tasks were guess the age of the people in the picture, guess the wealth of the people in the picture, and determine how familiar these people were with each other. They also had a memory task where they told people to memorize the picture and they would ask questions about it afterwards. But of course, they were only interested in the eye movements. So they took all of those eye movements from these 4 different tasks and trained this support vector machine algorithm. Unfortunately, they weren't able to train this classifier to above average performance. So guessing would give you correct answers 25% of the time, and their classifier was around 25% accuracy as well. So they decided that they weren't able to successfully classify, unfortunately, because this was a wonderful idea. Jarvis showed it one direction, they really wanted to be able to show it another direction. So there's been a couple of other attempts since then that have tried other ways of going about this. So Shikvera et al. In 2013 tried a different approach. They tried a Bayesian algorithm. And this one's a little bit different. It's not linear anymore. It allows for non-linear patterns. So that gave it a little bit more of an advantage. They also tried a number of different tasks. They tried 2 different reading tasks. One true reading and one sort of fake reading, and also a search task, so search for an item in the image, and a memorization task. So we have different tasks and different algorithms. And they use different measures as well, where Green used sort of this salience map of location. They used low-level means of and standard deviation of the fixation properties itself. So the fixation duration and I think it was mostly fixation duration and saccadic amplitude. And they were able to classify above chance. So I think it was around 30% accurate with these 4 tasks. So again, 30% isn't perfect. It's not always right. But this is very noisy data. This is just looking at your eye movements to determine whether you can predict whether those eye movements happened in a search task or in a memorization task. So it was above chance. Bordy et al. Have also just came up with a paper where they also did a quasi-linear algorithm called boosting. It basically puts a whole bunch of algorithms together to try to find the best one. And they looked at the same Green tasks, but also the Jarvis original tasks. And they also took a look at the Green idea that you can use a salience map to determine as input to this classifier. So they to jump to the punchline, they were able to successfully classify tasks based on the input. But for this salience map information, which is basically localization or spatial information, that only worked within the same image. So that type of information wasn't able to classify for different images. And that makes sense, because if I'm searching this room for someone, and I have a very particular pattern of eye movements, and then I try to use those eye movements to predict what I'm doing when I'm searching through a group of books, it's not going to be very effective. It depends on, so localization information is very dependent on the image. Whereas the low-level eye movement information, like the fixation duration, does go across image. So that does work no matter what image you're looking at. And another thing they were able to find was that they went back to the old green tasks, and they were able to classify that slightly above average, significantly so, just enough that they were able to predict slightly above chance. But using the Jarvis original tasks, they had a much, much higher accuracy rate, I think around 40 or 45%. So it not only depends on what type of eye movement information you use, it also depends on what the tasks are. Some tasks are much easier to differentiate with different groups of eye movements. Some tasks produce similar types of eye movements, some tasks produce very different types of eye movements. So the input properties matter, so spatial properties must align with both task and image. And aggregate saccadic features are more generalizable. So the fixation duration, the amplitude, those types of things are much better predictors of your task in this experiment. And also the algorithm matters as well. So this was where we came in. And we wanted to look at a number of different things, try to extend this in a few different ways. We wanted to find out which eye movement properties matter. You saw by our descriptive data that some eye movement patterns, like eye movement data, like fixation durations, show different things. So we wanted to find out which properties are more important in determining task. And we'll add a few new ones in there as well. The velocity of the eye movement, so the peak velocity of the eye movement, the duration of the eye movement, the amplitude and the relative amplitude of the eye movement will include all of these things. In addition, we wanted to take a look at a single eye movement. All of the other algorithms looked at mean aggregate saccadic properties for an entire trial, which is very useful because eye movements are very noisy. And by taking the aggregate of those variables across an entire trial, you're reducing the amount of noise. So that was very useful. We wanted to see if we can predict classify tasks based on a single eye movement. And then for the next step, we wanted to take this to see if we can create a generative model of search that included top-level, top-down task and attentional state.
Как вы видите, было очень много работ, которые пытались решить эту проблему до сих пор. Если говорить точно, то 3, и эти работы различались по подходу. Они различались по алгоритмам машинного обучения, которые использовались, они различались по тем характеристикам напряжения глаз, которые использовались, и они различались по задачам, которые решали испытуемые, и которые, соответственно, пытался восстановить далее классификатор. И важно, что в том случае, если попытка классификации потерпела неуспех, это еще не значит, что в принципе информация о задаче не может быть извлечена из параметров движения глаз, может быть просто что-то было взято неудачно, либо метод, либо параметр движения глаз, либо задачи, которые использовались. Одни задачи легче различаются, чем другие. Ну, в частности, первая работа, которая была выполнена в лаборатории Джереми Вольфа, принесла ощутимого результата. Там были взяты задачи близкие к ярмусовским, и их не удалось различить на основе линейного классификатора. Но в последующих двух работах был получен успешно работающий классификатор. В частности, оказалось, что ярмусовские задачи, исходные ярмусовские задачи гораздо лучше классифицируются и различаются, чем некоторые другие. К списку этих задач были добавлены такие очевидные задачи, как зрительный поиск и чтение. И также очень важно оказалось, какие именно характеристики движений глаз использовать. Потому что такие характеристики, как, например, распределение фиксаций, будут очень сильно привязаны к конкретному изображению. Нужно брать такие характеристики, которые можно переносить с одного изображения на другое, которые будут характеризовать собственную задачу, а не конкретное изображение. В частности, поэтому в своих дальнейших попытках построить успешный классификатор Джо использовал не только характеристики средние по всем саккадам, но и характеристики отдельных саккад, и в частности к этим характеристикам были добавлены скорость и длительность саккад.
What does everything mean? The 30% of accuracy.
30%
above the average.
Yes, when you have 4 tasks, if you're random, you will get it predict 25% of the time. So with a 30% accuracy means that it's above chance, but maybe not so much. You only need to beat 25% to be above random. So that means that 5% of the time you're doing it, you are accurately predicting. We'll do better than 30%. We'll see that. But we wanted to see how good it could get. And to do that, we started with a data set that had already been shown to have behavioral differences in eye movements. And one data set that had that was Michael Dodd et al. Back in 2009 had an experiment where he had 4 different tasks, and he was measuring inhibition of return in these 4 tasks. And he found that, again, there's plenty of participants, images, and over 17,000 eye movements, so there's lots of data for our algorithm to learn. And what he found was that inhibition of return could be measured in search tasks, but not in memorization, preference, or free viewing. So given that this data set showed very low-level attentional differences, we thought this was a great data set to try and build our classifier on. So we took this data set and tried to do the inverse. Based on all of these eye movements, can we predict which of those 4 tasks the participant was given? So we went for a naive Bayesian algorithm. So this uses Bayes' rule to try to infer the specific from the general. So all of these are eye movement information about particular eye movements. So the angle, we already mentioned the relative angle of the eye movement, the amplitude of the eye movement, the relative amplitude compared to the previous eye movement, the latency, velocity, duration, all of these properties of the eye movement. And this is the task or condition that the participant was in for that test. A naive Bayes algorithm assumes that all of these input properties are independent. So it's a very simple assumption, but usually not correct. But we thought it was a good place to start. A naive Bayes algorithm is a very good baseline to begin with. Later, we also use an augmented Bayes that tried to learn the structure of those properties. So it no longer assumes that these eye movement properties are independent, but it learns things like the amplitude influences the duration, and the amplitude influences the velocity. Those things are learned from within the data itself. We didn't put those into the algorithm. We used tenfold cross-validation to try to keep our algorithm from overtraining. And this means that we used 90% of our eye movements to train these algorithms, and then a brand new 10% of the data to test, to make sure that it would still work on new data that it hadn't seen before. And for chance, we compare it to the same model with conditions randomly assigned. So we randomize the condition and then check to see what percentage that would give. So the first result, our first classifier with the naive Bayesian algorithm. We use the mean saccadic data, the same as the other experiments. So we took all of the eye movements for a single trial, usually 6 seconds of eye movements, and we took the average properties of those eye movements. And we managed to get an algorithm that was 46% accurate, so approaching 50% accuracy. And it was only able to successfully classify 3 of our 4 tasks. This is called a confusion matrix. Not because it's confusing, but because it shows how the algorithm was confused. So for the viewing task, it successfully classified viewing task as viewing 68% of the time. It incorrectly classified it as memorized 12.8% of the time, preference as 13, and search as 5.7. Memorize, again, it classified as viewing 23% of the time. So anything on the diagonal is a correct classification. Any of these others are times when the algorithm incorrectly classified. So we want to look at the diagonal for our good accuracy numbers. And 3 of our tasks were classified well above chance. Our viewing and search tasks were classified at 68% and 59% of the time. And again, remember, roughly 25% is random chance. That would just be from guessing. So we had a very good first stab at an algorithm for classification.
В качестве первого шага получать набор данных, записанных заранее в другой лаборатории, это работа года 2009 года с коллегами. И идея заключалась в том, чтобы взять такой набор данных, на котором уже были показаны некоторые отличия одних задач от других, которые можно внятно сформулировать. В частности, что было показано в этой работе, что если взять 4 задачи: зрительный поиск, задачу запоминания того, что изображено на картинке, задачу свободного разглядывания и задачу оценить, насколько эта картинка вам нравится, то, в частности, торможение и возврата будет наблюдаться только в задаче поиска. Затем были взяты характеристики движений глаз по этому массиву данных и построен сначала наивный байесовский классификатор. Идея заключается в том, что вы берете множество параметров и пытаетесь выявить, какая же задача решалась. Причем в самом простом варианте вы предполагаете, что все эти параметры независимы, что, понятно, конечно же, не так. В более сложном варианте вы можете попробовать построить некоторую структуру, в частности, показать связи между амплитудой саккады и ее скоростью. И первая попытка, простой классификатор, принес достаточно хорошие результаты, как мы видели по матрице смешения. 3 из 4 задач такой классификатор вполне успешно обнаружил. Матрицы, заметили, что были строчки столбцы, соответственно, можно было посмотреть, в каком проценте случаев классификатор принимал одну задачу за другую, или же, соответственно, решал задачу классификации правильно.
So, the next thing we wanted to do, like I said, was the augmented Bayesian algorithm. So if we don't assume this independence of eye movement properties, and we allow the algorithm to learn some sort of structure of eye movement patterns, then will this improve the accuracy of the classifier? So this is the structure that the algorithm learned using expectation maximization algorithm. These may not be the ways that we would classify the different eye movement patterns, but this is the relationship that the algorithm learned. So, for instance, the arrows here show some type of influence, or not by causality, but at least influence. So the amplitude of an eye movement influences what the duration of it is. And that sort of makes sense. The longer the eye movement, the longer it takes. So it correctly learns some sort of relationship there. And the same with the velocity. The amplitude influences what the velocity of it is. We may think that the inference should have been the other direction, but at least it was smart enough to learn an association between these two eye movement properties. And given that it learned this structure, and then we try it again with the same classification problem, with this new augmented-based algorithm, we were able to improve the overall accuracy up to 52.4%. So the more accurate algorithm wrote those assumptions significantly improved our classification accuracy. And viewing was now up to almost 80% accurate on that one particular task. Search up to 61%, and memorize up to 46%. Now, even though preference was at 33%, I don't have that highlighted as classifying above chance.
Could you remind me what is the preference task?
The preference task was just looking at the image and rating how much you enjoyed it on a Likert scale of 1 to 7. It's a more ambiguous task, and that's why we think that it was harder to classify. But I still claim that that's not above chance because classifiers can be biased toward answering one way or the other. And when I compared this result to my randomized baseline, so remember, instead of just a basic 25% accuracy baseline, I trained this algorithm when I randomized the task. So for every eye movement, I assigned it a random task. And then I tried to see if that classifier could learn those. And on that one, it also managed over 33% on preference. Overall, it was 25%. It was purely random. But it was biased towards answering preference. So we thought that this algorithm might also be biased towards answering preference. And that if it were unbiased, the other ones would go up as preference goes down to 25. We're actually saying it wasn't as good as it may look in the pictures. So finally, we had a very good classifier. It was over 50% on all of our tasks. Some of our tasks, it was actually up to 80% accuracy. So we were very pleased with that. Now we wanted to give it a real challenge. So all of those earlier ones were based on average eye movement for an entire trial, for the full 6 seconds. But what about a single eye movement from those trials? If we show the algorithm just one eye movement and the pattern from that, can we still tell what task generated that eye movement? So this is 300 milliseconds worth of data that we're giving this classifier. And given that, we still had a 35% overall accuracy. So we were still able to classify tasks at above chance levels given a single eye movement. Of course, only our two good ones, view and search, were the ones that were showing any real improvement, and they were at about 40%. But it was, again, a slightly biased algorithm because the other two were slightly below chance. So these are probably a little bit inflated. We would expect the accuracy to be more around maybe 40% or 42% if it weren't biased against answering the other two. So we were able to classify on a single eye movement.
Actually, I have a question about the translation. So what do you mean by single eye movement? Is it the very only single eye movement or just a series of single eye movements?
This is the average prediction given every single eye movement. So at any given time, we choose one eye movement and see if it can predict the accuracy. And then we say yes or no. 35% of those single eye movements, we were able to predict what task it was in.
Okay, so and then you just average the predictions based on single eye movements.
Yes, exactly.
Okay, so that's a little bit confusing when we say single eye movement. Так, что мы видим, если мы добавим некоторую структуру классификатора, то есть предположим, что существуют связи между параметрами движения глаз, которые используются для вычисления задач. Тоже получается достаточно хорошо, получается достаточно высокий уровень возможностей классификатора в плане предсказания задачи, но по-прежнему из 4 исследуемых задач страдала одна задача, это задача оценивания того, насколько вам эта картинка нравится. Более подробное изучение материала показало, что классификатор, по-видимому, всегда просто несколько ошибается в пользу этой картинки, у него есть тенденция всегда считать, что решалась задача оценки, насколько вам эта картинка нравится, и поэтому получились такие результаты. Что касается 3 остальных задач, для них разработанный классификатор подходит. Ну и, наконец, самая сложная часть, что же будет, если мы попробуем оценить...
Wasn't it biased towards search?
So the question is, what task the classifier was biased towards, because there was a part with an explanation where the reference task was not so good.
This one here,
Mm-hmm.
this data set, with the bias on this slide was for this one here, why I think that this one is not above chance. And that's because I set a different baseline. For me, the baseline was what it predicted for random tasks. So I took all of the eye movements and I randomized which task it belonged to. And for that, it also ended up at 33% here. So for that, it told me that this algorithm is biased towards answering preference. And that's why I think that it might be above chance, but...
You did yourself.
Right. So I'm not convinced that that is above chance.
Соответственно, переведу тогда тоже эту часть, потому что это достаточно сложный момент. Вопрос был двойной вопрос. Во-первых, почему, если у нас 33% получилось успешности классификатором, Джозеф считает, что он все равно не сработал в отношении этой задачи выше, чем случайным образом. И второй, соответственно, вопрос, а почему же, собственно, мы считаем, что именно в сторону этой задачи был уклон классификатора. Ответ такой. Если мы поставим базовый уровень в 25% и будем считать, что все, что выше 25%, это успешная классификация, то действительно до 33% больше 25%. Но проблема в том, что классификатор может иметь некоторую предрасположенность классифицировать материал тем или иным образом. Поэтому был введен другой контрольный уровень для успешности классификатора, который был посчитан так, что набором данных случайно присваивалась одна из 4 задач. Не просто взяли из умозрительных соображений 25%, а симулировали вот такие данные. И посмотрели, как классификатор будет работать с ними. Понятно, что если набором данных случайно присваивается та или иная задача, никакой реальной структуры в этих данных нет. Тем не менее, классификатор имеет тенденцию работать так, как будто бы структура все-таки есть и имеет небольшой уклон в сторону задачи оценки предпосылки. И, соответственно, последняя, самая сложная часть – это каким образом классификатор работает, если мы даем ему не всю картину по всем сакадам, которые были, не по средним характеристикам, а даем только одну единственную сакаду и ее характеристики. Соответственно, по каждой сакаде, по первой, по второй, по третьей, четвертой, пятой, шестой и так далее, брались данные, и на основе только этой одной сакады, первой или второй или третьей, и так далее, производилась классификация, а дальше результаты по различным саккадам усреднялись. И оказалось, что на основе единичной саккады тоже можно предсказать вот, как минимум задачу зрительного поиска и задачу свободного просмотра.
So, we managed to get some good results out of this. We found that task matters. We were able to successfully classify 3 out of our 4 tasks. 2 of them were consistently very highly accurate. So memorization and search, we were able to get above, quite a bit above chance consistently, even with a single language. And this isn't surprising since search was one of the ones that showed very low-level attention effects. The original data set showed inhibition of return in the search task, but not in the other tasks. So we already knew that there were low-level behavioral differences in the eye movements for that particular task. But even those successful tasks vary in accuracy. So the task really does matter. The algorithm also matters. Our good algorithm that didn't make assumptions about the dependence of eye movements was able to do a much better job than an algorithm that made improper assumptions. The observation properties matter. So different properties of eye movements have different influence on the accuracy. If you take a look at the thickness of the lines here, that's actually measuring the strength of influence in this algorithm. So thicker lines have more influence on this classifier than thin lines. So our velocity velocity and duration are 2 of the more important properties that really help with our classification here. And velocity in particular was one that we didn't expect. That was one we added at the last minute, and no one else had used in their classifier. But the velocity of the saccade seems to be very important in being able to group that eye movement for classification. And every eye movement matters. So on average, an eye movement, even a single eye movement can tell you which task it is at above chance levels.
Probably questions? Давайте зададим вопросы.
Usually when we make such experiments, we suppose that subjects strongly follow our instructions. Mm-hmm. Are you sure in that?
Of course not. To be certain, we're never entirely certain, but we do have some evidence that they did. The first is the behavioral evidence, that since we're able to classify those tasks based on instructions, that tells us that the eye movement patterns were very different for each of those instruction cases. And that means that even if they weren't following our instructions, they were doing different things for those different tasks. I also have a similar concern as you, and for this model that's coming up, I'm going to hopefully show that the instructions or task that we give is very different from the internal state, the attentional state that the participant had during those tasks. And I'll show you how I separate those in a few minutes.
It can be some mechanism influence.
Right. And hopefully I'll show that there was even more than 4 different attentional states going on.
Maybe it explains that rate of classification not so high.
Right. Yes.
Mm-hmm.
You're anticipating some of what we're going to do, so that's wonderful. We did. Thank you.
Еще вопросы? And then probably a naive question from myself. So in the data set you used, it was shown that there is no IRR for memorization task, right? But from the first part of your talk, we have learned that salience is a very important factor, and if we had no IRR, then we would just start with a certain point on the image. So what happens with this program when we go on for memorization task?
Good question. It's not the idea with salience helping prevent us from going back to locations that we've already visited. We're not saying that that's the only thing that keeps us from going back in space. This is a mid-level or low-level attention effect or mechanism. There's obviously top-down influences that help us choose where we look. We can choose to look anywhere in the scene that we want to. There's nothing inside the visual cortex that prevents us from looking at locations. The one thing that we showed with that earlier data set is that this low-level attention mechanism is one of the influences that helps prevent us from going back. And when we override that low-level mechanism, we saw the effect in the latency. Remember that 0-0 graph, where we were slower to react to that location. So when we do choose to override that tendency of that inhibitory tag, we pay the price in latency, in response time. So the other mechanisms will certainly help us from going back to locations, working memory, and so on.
But is IRR specific for the search task?
It seems to be. That's what the DOD data has shown us, that in visual search seems to be something very particular, where we leave these inhibitory tags in the scene to help prevent us from going back to those locations. Whereas memorization is a very different task, and sometimes you may want to go back to those previously visited locations if you don't have a good memory representation. So it may not make as much sense to leave inhibitory tags in those tasks.
Еще вопросы? So, okay, probably I'm the only one who still had questions. So the next one is about the structure of your classifier. How do you figure out all those arrows? Some of them fit and some of them fit. So the relations between psychotic properties. So do you extract them from some other data sets, or do you just try various versions of how they look?
This is one of the really fun and rewarding things about machine learning and artificial intelligence, is that the computer works for you. I set up these algorithms, and I go home for the night and I have supper, and my computer's in the office working away, trying to come up with these diagrams for me. And that's what it is. We give it the data set, and it learns from an algorithm called expectation maximization. So it goes through the data, learns the relationship between these things through sometimes trial and error, but always trying to improve its accuracy. So given the data, these are the types of algorithms, the type of structure that it learns that is an optimal fit for that particular data set.
Is it possible that you get a complete nonsense?
Sometimes, yes. With the complete nonsense, we wouldn't see something like. So here we see the thickness of the line showing that it's learned a very strong relationship between two sympathetic properties. If it were complete nonsense, then those lines probably wouldn't be very strong. It would learn either the naive algorithm. If we run this algorithm and we end up with something like the top one, then we learn that they really are independent. So it learns a structure that is best for that data. And if there are no relationships, then that type of structure might be best for that data. Or is it dependent?
Вопросы?
Do you want to give that answer?
Требуется ли перевод последних вопросов и ответов? По-видимому, нет. Тогда следующий вопрос. Требуется ли перерыв перед последней частью? Курение, чай и все остальное? Или не требуется? Если ничего, да, не будет вообще.
Давайте прервемся на...
Начальное, да.
Ну, давайте тогда сделаем перерыв на 10 минут. За это время будет